For a number of years, I've had one serious goal on this channel that's never wavered: create a video ranking every 32X game. The main issue with doing this is it takes considerable time if you're going to do it right. You must invest yourself into each game and consider all factors if you want to be fair in the assessments given. Otherwise, you're just making another throwaway video. I still plan on doing this at some point, but more recently, I've been considering my taste in games compared to others I know and how that all stacks up. That brought up a question I wanted to answer. You see, it's hard to look back at reviews that were published when most retro games were launched and get a clear, honest answer for two reasons. First off, we now know that old reviews were heavily influenced by money and behind-the-scenes politics. If a company spent considerable money advertising with a publication, there was pressure to deliver favorable reviews no matter the quality of the product. Second, games were often judged on how well they met certain expectations of the era. In some cases, the technical execution on screen was all that mattered. In a modern sense, it would be like giving Mario Kart 8 on Switch a poor review because it could be done on the prior generation hardware. Returning to the 32X, WWF Raw is an excellent example here. It's hard not to argue that the two best WWF games on a home console up to this point were both on the 32X. It may not be a top 10 contender, but they're both solid games, even by today's standard. By looking at old reviews, the dated art style is often the catalyst for the terrible scores it received. The general consensus was that the game could be done on the Genesis and had no place on the 32X. So if old publications are unreliable, and one person's opinion is hardly a standard bearer in determining the quality of a library, then what's the next step? I felt the criteria was simple and obvious. Find fellow creators who are familiar with the entire 32X library, having spent sizable time with every game. I narrowed this down to a list of 7 individuals who I was personally familiar with and trusted to be fair and unbiased. These are creators who focus on retro games with an appreciation for the 32X in addition to other systems. I asked each of them to submit their list, ranking games from 1 to 10, assigning them points to reflect the position given, then did the math to determine what games across the 8 top 10 list made the cut. I'll talk a bit more about this at the end along with some honorable mentions, but for now, let's get into it. This is Retro Impressions, a definitive 32X top 10. I think it's safe to say that Calibri was one of the most unique gaming experiences available during the 4th generation. It's a bit hard to nail it down to one genre because at times it's a side-scrolling shooter, focuses on exploration, or exhibits the occasional light puzzle mechanic. It may not surprise you to learn that the game was developed by the same team behind the Echo series, and with that being the case, also features a story that connects nature to extraterrestrial life. Actually, there's a number of subtle parallels that would lead the player to believe that these games take place in the same universe. It's important to know that this game is best played after reading the manual, as the gameplay isn't quite intuitive. I talked to a few people who turned the game off before ever getting started due to the confusion at the start, so it's highly recommended that you read it over before you start the game. Calibri is a masterclass in level flow and design. The HUD disappearing to leave the playfield unobstructed is highly appreciated. The game also excels in giving a sense of completing an actual journey once the credits roll. In addition, there's a number of settings in the option menu to enhance the game, including 2-player support and critical control options that impact the in-game experience. I remember a garbage review for this game back when it released that complained about the controls and some other stuff that seemed far removed from the game I was experiencing. I shook my head as it was clear the reviewer didn't look very hard, as the option was there to address their complaint, fully alleviating one of his biggest problems. In short, Calibri is reason enough to own a 32X. There's very little I can say negative about the experience, and think if the gameplay style appeals to you, or if you enjoy the Echo games, you'll almost certainly find this to be an instant favorite as well.
Space Harrier is absolutely my favorite game on the Sega 32X, and here's why. Some of you might be like, what? This is your favorite game? It's one of my favorite games of all time, the arcade game. And so this is such an amazing port of the arcade classic by Sega that it automatically is super high up there. And honestly, just going through the entire 32X library, I do love so many of the games, but I love Space Harrier so much that it's my #1 pick. And honestly, this was such a great game to put on the Sega 32X because it was such a promise of what we could possibly get later, because it was this and Afterburner that came out, and they were both perfect, almost perfect, not exactly perfect, arcade ports of classic Yu Suzuki arcade games. And I played this port so many times. I was a huge fan of the game. I had it on the Sega Master System. I loved the Sega Master System version of the game. The arcade game was one of the first games I ever played in my life. In fact, my dad would often tell me that it was the first game I ever played in the arcade as a small child. And it's a game that really just gets me right here. You know, some people, they hear music in a game and it just takes them back. And for me, the music in this game, it just makes me feel like a kid again. And the gameplay is rock solid. I mean, it's fast-paced. This is what Sega was all about. Fast-paced, in-your-face action, arcade action. And Space Harrier is second to none.
So while the library is not perfect, I love the 32X. In fact, I have a full US retail collection of the 32X myself. But as far as one game that really sticks out to me that I absolutely love and adore, it's Saxons Mother Base 2000. And this game here, one of the main reasons why I love this game is that first of all, I'm a big fan of space shooters, of shmups. And I'm a fan of the original Zaxxon. Like, I remember playing it in the arcade with my dad, and I always thought it was a fun game. So when this game got announced for the 32X, I was like, really? Like, Zaxxon's making a comeback? I'm like, oh, okay. So basically about this game, the unique kind of quirk is that, yeah, it's an isometric shooter similar to the original Zaxxon, but now you have the ability to jump and to hack into your enemies. So whenever you see most of the enemies, now of course some of them that are either too big or they're too small, you might not be able to jump into and hack, and of course results in death. But whenever you hack into it, you basically have to let it go for a little tiny bit as it seeps into the system of the enemy, and it lets out this ready, and lets out this loud ready, basically telling you that you can now use their weapon, and you can stay inside the enemy to get a couple of more hits because they'll give you a little bit of extra health because you're a one-hit wonder, no less after that. But then all you have to do after that is that you can hang on to that weapon until you hijack and hack another vehicle, and that's really, really cool. It basically opens up the limitations of what you can do with, like, say, ooh, I wonder what kind of weapon I'm going to get from this enemy, and what kind of weapon I'm going to get from this enemy, and it's really, really cool on that aspect too. And I also love the ambition behind the game too. Now, as somebody who came from a fan of the original Zaxxon, I'd say this game is a little bit less like the original Zaxxon and more like Viewpoint. Like, if you've ever heard of a game on the Neo Geo, it was ported to the Genesis, and it was also on the PlayStation 1. Viewpoint, where it's an isometric shooter just like this. The enemies weren't quite polygonal, but they were very polygonal-ish. Meanwhile, all the enemies in Zaxxon are full-on polygonal, and they both have similar sort of unique vibes, because one of the things I love most about Zaxxon is its soundtrack. Its soundtrack is incredible. As somebody who in the mid-90s was a big fan of techno and like Euro kind of sounds to it, the music in this is incredible. Again, drawing comparisons to Viewpoint, where Viewpoint is more like a kind of house, relaxed kind of vibe. Zaxxon is the super high tempo, high beats, like electro kind of sound, or electronic kind of sound to it. And it might seem like it's out of place at first, but once you start playing it and you really start gripping into it, it's just, oh, it's like magnifique. The game is very hard. It's very, very hard. You're going to die a lot. And by a lot, I mean a lot. Until once you start getting the aspect of what enemies do what, and how to basically avoid the other types of hazards and whatnot to come down. It's a really, really fun game, but it's also, in my opinion, one of the more technologically impressive games on the 32X, because, like I said, every enemy is a polygon, but they're made of multiple different types of polygons. They're still non-textured and whatnot in typical 32X fashion, but it's just so much fun to look at, especially when you get to, say, stage 4, when you're actually out on the ocean and you see the water and the polygonal fish like actually jumping through, and the music on the boss in that stage is awesome too. And it really gets your blood pumping. as you're playing through the game. And that, to me, that's basically the catalyst of a great shooter, is that it really gets your blood pumping, and that's exactly what Saxon does. So, I mean, if any other games like this, like, sure, there are 32X games that I could say are better than Saxon's Mother Base 2000, but I don't really think that there are any that are quite as unique, dare I say it, and that's why I really enjoy it.
When I think of a definitive version of something, only one absolute comes to mind. NBA Jam on the 32X, in my mind, has to be the end-all be-all of the NBA Jam franchise. I grew up playing NBA Jam on the Genesis constantly against my friends and brothers, and I always reflect positively on that time in my life. NBA Jam is a great, well-balanced game that, even if someone isn't into basketball, they could pick up the game and have a good time because of how well put together the game was. The game was fluid, it had rich colors, and had great cheat codes, like playing against President Bill Clinton. I remember sneaking across the street in the middle of the night to play it against my neighbors on their Genesis. It was a great title that I'll always hold fondly because of those memories. It's a game I spent countless hours playing. For me, when I first played the 32X version of the game, something about it was just great, and it set itself above the base Genesis version. It even felt above the Super Nintendo port, in terms of how responsive it was. One summer, my brother convinced our mother to rent a 32X. I really didn't understand the system at the time. I thought it was kind of like a base power converter, and didn't really get that it added new power to the platform. So we started out by playing Primal Rage, which was pretty awesome because what kid doesn't love prehistoric beasts? And I don't remember thinking much of it, aside from how pretty it looked when I thought about comparing that game to the arcade version. But after that, we played NBA Jam. And NBA Jam was one of the few sports games I could hold my own in against my brothers, who often crushed me at Madden. But NBA Jam, I could compete. And NBA Jam on the 32X, however, was just smoother and felt more fluid and looked nicer in appearance and colors than what I had seen before. Even the characters had better coloring. The characters were lighter and just less contrasting than the prior versions of the game. Even the faces on the players appeared to have more detail. The audience had extra layers of depth to them, and they moved with a vibrance that wasn't quite matched on any 16-bit version of the game. Even the richness of the players running went dramatically smoother, with just about every movement. We played the system late into the evening, and had a really great time. From then on, I've always held NBA Jam on the 32X as the definitive version of the game. I've since played it on every other platform, ranging from the Saturn to the Sega CD, and the 32X in terms of how it feels remains one of the best versions to me. Granted, its graphics kind of pale in comparison to that of the Saturn, Jaguar, and DOS versions of the game, but the 32X port has always held its own in my mind. Even when compared to the arcade, it still holds up quite well. I'm not going to tell you it's the absolute best, because that's a matter of subjective opinion, but I will tell you once you play the 32X version, there is something about it that isn't quite there in just about any other version of NBA Jam.
The first 3D fighting game that absolutely blew people's minds was, of course, Virtua Fighter in the arcades, and Virtua Fighter saw home versions on the Sega Saturn and the Sega 32X. Strangely enough, the Sega Saturn version of the game came out before the 32X version of the game. But in order to alleviate that problem, Sega actually released something pretty cool called the Special Training Pack for Virtua Fighter 32X. Inside of this, you got a t-shirt, a VHS tape that would give you some moves, and a $20 voucher towards your purchase of Virtua Fighter on the 32X when it finally released. The final product of Virtua Fighter on the 32X is honestly very impressive, and arguably better than the Sega Saturn version. Now, while the Sega Saturn version of the game might have looked better, I feel that the Virtua Fighter on the 32X actually played better, and really at the end of the day, that's more important. Sure, the 32X had more blocky sprites, but the gameplay just felt very smooth, and much more like the arcade version, whereas the Sega Saturn version was definitely rushed to the market. The weird thing about this version of the game, though, is that it actually supports anamorphic 16:9 widescreen, which is something that was pretty unheard of at the time for a lot of home console games, as we were playing on CRT TVs. I think Virtua Fighter on the 32X is my favorite 32X game just because it was one of the reasons I wanted a system so bad. It just looked so cool and I loved the arcade game, so to have this game in my home on a cartridge was just very awesome to me.
Tempo, check it out. Yeah, he's funky, and he's good to go. Oh! Yeah, you know, that was the first thing I heard when I first popped in Tempo into my 32X Sega Genesis, Sega CD, Frankenstein monster of a machine. I got this game on my 9th birthday, which was quite a 32X birthday when I think about it, because I also got Knuckles Chaotix. And oh gosh, you know, this game was such a throwback to those classic 1940s style. Ren and Stimpy, you know, obviously was inspired by the Looney Tunes, but I'm talking about Betty Boop, Max Fleischer, old school golden era cartoons, and mix that with like Japanese anime style, and you get Tempo. It's this awesome game, this awesome platformer that really, it's incredibly colorful, is very challenging, but I love the character. And there he is right there. Yeah, hey Tempo, what's going on, buddy? Like, seriously, what a cool character. And really, this was a game that just got lost in the shuffle. Unfortunately, it was on the 32X. And I say that not to diss the 32X, because I do love the 32X, but if this character was maybe a few years before 1995, and it was on, you know, the Sega Genesis as a star character, or even the Super Nintendo, you know, I feel like the character and the game and the franchise could have succeeded on a much larger level. You know, it reminds me of these classic Sega platformers that we all love, like Dynamite Headdy and Ristar, whatever you want to call them. These were classics. These were great. These were unfortunately largely forgotten and overshadowed by Sonic the Hedgehog. And it's just unfortunate. Tempo is a very great game, and I really think you should check it out if you haven't. You know, it also got released on the Game Gear as Tempo Junior in Japan, and then also there was a Japanese sequel only came out in Japan called Super Tempo, and that is extremely hard to find. I actually used to own it back when I had my entire collection, and I actually sold that a few years back to Joe Redifer of GameSack. It was a game he was looking for, and so he currently owns my copy of Super Tempo, and I know he's treating it well. But, you know, it's a character that I do miss seeing. I don't know why an indie developer hasn't come around, and I guess Sega owns the rights to the character, and it's like, what are you doing, Sega? You're just sitting on this awesome little grasshopper character that you own. So, come on, Sega. Give this guy to Lizard Cube, an indie developer, somebody who, like the guys that made Streets of Rage, Lizard Cube, somebody who can do something amazing with such an amazing IP.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Jenovi's Retro Impressions. My name is Rob, and I'll be your host for the next few minutes as we discuss my favorite 32X game. It's Star Wars Arcade, so stick around. In Star Wars Arcade, you have the option to choose the iconic X-Wing fighter. The X-Wing fighter is awesome. It's the only fighter in the arcade mode, but in 32X mode, you get to enjoy the Y-Wing. The Y-Wing is only available in 2-player mode, which is really the only way to play, because the 2-player mode with the Y-Wing in 32X mode, you get 8 shields. In Star Wars Arcade, you will battle TIE fighters amidst fields of endless superstar destroyers while you dodge their relentless fire. In the game, you will find yourself storming the Imperial Death Star, wiping out its internal defenses, taking on Darth Vader's TIE fighter, and wiping out enemy forces. This trek will take you on an implementation of the famous trench run from the first movie, Star Wars: A New Hope. You will also find yourself within the bowels of a superstar destroyer, blowing it up from the inside, dodging enemy fire, dodging its defenses, and dodging the walls. Most often you'll find yourself fighting in asteroid fields. These can be bland environments, but despite that fact, Star Wars Arcade has the variety to keep things interesting. All in all, the game is held back only by one thing, which is its legendary difficulty. Not only are you timed on levels, but as you go on, The AI gets increasingly more difficult. They'll shoot you from behind without a chance to see them. They'll kamikaze right at you from dead ahead. Still, this is a fun and inexpensive 32X game, one that's worth owning the system for.
Knuckles Chaotix. What a strange game that came out on the 32X. Knuckles Chaotix is probably one of the most bizarre Sonic the Hedgehog games. I mean, some people don't want to call it that, but to me, it's a Sonic the Hedgehog game. Come on, and just because it doesn't star him. But you know, Knuckles Chaotix came out in 1995, and I remember getting this game on my 9th birthday. It was a huge surprise. Knuckles Chaotix on the 32X, it was like, okay, here's a brand new Sonic game. Like, it's going to be just as great as Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles or even Sonic 2. And unfortunately, it's not as good as those games. But if you walk into Knuckles Chaotix, the game starring Knuckles, and you accept it for what it is, it's a slower pace, a little more methodical, and a little more of an interesting, buddy system that you have to use as you're hoisting each other around with these rings and that strange force field that basically, bounces you around the room together. It was unique. It was like this tether system, and I've never seen another game really do that. And to put it in a Sonic game, I don't know if it really was necessary, and it's not what people necessarily wanted either, but it's still a really good game, a great game, I would even say. If you can get around that and stop thinking and wanting a Sonic game, it to be a Sonic game, and just like it for its own merits, accept it for what it is. It's a solid game, incredibly colorful. It uses great use of the Sega 32X extra colors that add-on added to the Sega Genesis, and I love just how detailed everything is, and just the music's great. It's got a great soundtrack. It's awesome. It's excellent. I wouldn't say it's like the best game on the Sega 32X, because I have a soft spot for another one that I'm going to talk about in this video, but I do really enjoy Knuckles Chaotix, and it's one that I return to every few years, not more than once a year.
Hey everyone, John Linneman from DF Retro here, today to talk about Shadow Squadron, or Stellar Assault in Japan. Developed internally at Sega with assistance from animation studio Artmic, responsible for shows such as Bubblegum Crisis, Shadow Squadron is a first-person space combat game where you take out waves of enemies across a 1 to 2 hour campaign. At its core, it's a very simple game, but it's also a game I think that makes really good use of the 32X hardware. A lot of games in the system were known for somewhat unstable frame rates when they pushed a lot of 3D graphics around, but in this case, it runs at a very smooth rate. The ships themselves are reasonably detailed, though flat textured, and just spinning around, moving in 360 degrees through space, really helps make for an entertaining and smooth feeling game. Compared to stuff like Star Wars Arcade or Dark Side, the game feels a little bit more open-ended in its mission design while also looking better and running smoother. It's also paired with a fantastic soundtrack that perfectly works with the action on display. Now, this is a rare one in that we didn't actually see too many really high-end 3D games come from these other teams within Sega. Of course, there were the AM2 ports, including Virtua Fighter, Virtua Racing Deluxe, and whatnot, but this is a really original production, and it only ever received a single sequel on the Sega Saturn produced by Sims instead. So what makes this game worth playing then? Well, basically it is this series of missions, usually with very simplistic objectives, but again, it's this core gameplay that really helps define it. Moving around in space in 360 degrees, finding your targets, taking them out. It's like a prototype to something like Ace Combat in space, I suppose you could say, and it actually works really, really well. If you have a 32X, you definitely have to check this one out.
Virtua Racing Deluxe on 32X. While the Genesis received a perfectly acceptable conversion only 9 months prior, it didn't add much to the formula, and while impressive for the aging 16-bit monolith, was visually and aurally compromised in spite of its use of the Sega Virtua Processor, or SVP. However, I feel this was a good thing. Sort of. When Virtua Racing Deluxe finally dropped, newcomers to the much maligned add-on could compare and see the difference. It's not arcade perfect, no, though it's a step up for sure. The polygonal renderings aren't dithered and twitchy, frame rate is smoother to the eye, and the audio doesn't sound as if it's being amplified by a soda can. If there's one thing both conversions share, it's the handling. Polished, responsive, and a joy to play with. Like your lady's pleasure palace on that first wedding anniversary, with the act itself serving as a victory lap of sorts while you blast Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now by Starship, slapping that dash with one hand while flipping off all your friends that said you wouldn't last 6 months when you're already 3 months into the relationship. Sorry. Virtua Racing Deluxe isn't a simple facelift. You get 2 new cars, stock and prototype, as well as 2 bonus tracks, giving players ample reason to trade in their aging but respectable Genesis adaptation for the new model. Not that you have much choice in the matter, 32X won't play it anyway. I think it's safe to say Virtua Racing Deluxe is an easy lay for the platform, for it doesn't have much competition in this particular dive, and it will readily slake your lust without ripping you off. In other words, it's easy to find, cheap, and satisfying.
One of the biggest arcade hits of the early 90s was of course the Mortal Kombat franchise, and Mortal Kombat 2 came to the Sega 32X. And while many people have fond memories of other arcade ports on the 32X, Mortal Kombat 2 often gets overlooked, and honestly, that's a shame. Of course, Mortal Kombat 2 came out on the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo, and those versions of the game were alright, but the Sega 32X version of the game was better overall. It had more color, it had larger sprites, which are very important in a fighting game. Now the game also did release on the Sega Saturn, and while that was more akin to the arcade version of the game, there was a big problem. When you chose Shang Tsung and you decided to morph into another character, the game would actually have to stop and load, and it took about 2 to 3 seconds in order to load that transformation. On the Sega 32X version of the game, you didn't have that problem. I think this is a really criminally underrated version of Mortal Kombat 2, and arguably the best home port of the game at the time. If you don't own this in your 32X collection and you're a Mortal Kombat fan, I mean, what are you waiting for? Go ahead and pick it up.
If you're at all familiar with the platform, then you undoubtedly know the history. Darkside was meant to be a launch title for the ill-fated all-in-one Genesis 32X unit code named Neptune, one of the last games released and only available in Europe. Many players dismiss it as a pretty, by 32X standards, 3D shooter in the same vein as Asteroids that's just as shallow and monotonous, though nowhere near as fun to play. I feel much of this has to do with folks playing a ROM, be it on a flashcard or emulator, dying on the first level, and just tossing it aside, like a non-biodegradable cup in the ocean already contaminated by microbeads, plastic straws, and Nintendo Wii shovelware. To be fair, the HUD is an issue for it's not self-explanatory, not without instructions. That, or a kind player by the name of Knuckles87 posting an in-depth user's guide on Sega Bits for all to enjoy. Once you understand how it works, you'll rip through that first mission, only to be inundated with new threats, some of which are unique to their respective mission, new weapons, and more involved objectives. Darkside has much more to offer than simply blasting space rocks. Visually, Darkside is a showpiece for 32X. Though it lacks the consistent frame rate of Shadow Squadron, it more than makes up for it with detailed and varied textures, sprite scaling and lighting effects, dazzling explosions, and delightfully cosmic colors that excite. And the music? Pure Genesis fed directly to the taste vein, laced with 80s inspired synthesized tension. It's awesome, and I want it on tape. I'm sorry, but this has more right in the top 10 than NBA Jam.
If you ask someone why they like the 32X, the most often cited reason I've heard is the high library quality. I've often argued that the 32X has one of the best libraries on average when compared to any other system out there. Of the 8 submissions for this video, 19 games were nominated to the top 10, and I can't fault any of the submissions given. That's 46% of the entire library if we include Mega 32X CD games. So as I close out, I wanted to share some info I found interesting while pulling this together. First off, not a single person chose the same 10 games. Of all the games nominated, only Virtual Racing made it to the top 10 on every list, and finally, pulling a video together like this wouldn't be possible without these fellow creators. So a big thank you to John from DF Retro, Tyler from My Retro Life, Rob from Retro Game Living Room, Sean aka RGT85, Ian aka HistoricNerd, G from G to the Next Level, and finally Andrew from Mastercast TV. I'll leave links below in the comment section, so make sure you check these channels out and support the ones you like. That's it for now, and as always, thank you for watching Retro Impressions.